All right, so this is part two of liberalism and core beliefs. Last time it was about human nature and society and the economy, and this time it's about the state. And really, that's because liberals have got a bit more to say about the state than the other ones, and we're going to try and cover these very briefly today. So you might ask first, why do liberals think we need a state at all? When we looked at the state of nature last time, unlike conservatives like Hobbes, who thought that we needed an authoritarian state which controlled people and stopped them from hacking each other to bits, liberals thought that we could cooperate with each other and that we were perfectly capable of being reciprocal and rational, and therefore we didn't have a war of all against all. So why bother with the state at all? And really, one way of looking at this is to think about it as if it's like a football match. We could, if we wanted, go out on Stanhope Park, and between us as a class, we could put some jumpers down for some goals and have a more or less reasonable sort of kickabout. But if we understood that in a football match there are likely to be some codified rules, then that would make it clear to absolutely everybody who was playing what was allowed and what wasn't, when we could have throw-ins, whether we played offside, and so on. And likewise, if there was a referee there to ensure fair play, it meant that even though most of us might want to play the game fairly, even if there was the sort of person who might want to foul and seek to get some sort of advantage, that referee would be there to make sure the rest of our rights to play the game fairly weren't being infringed on. So if the state's there for anything at all, it's to protect our freedom, it's to protect our individual liberty, and not, as conservatives and Hobbes would have it, to control us and to prevent us from being more horrible because the state assumes that we're all potentially bad people. Okay, so when we think about why, therefore, liberals think there should be a state, we'll need to think first about what the state is designed to do, what are its objectives. And in this case, we're going to think about these 5 things in turn: consent, tolerance, meritocracy, equality of opportunity, and justice. If we think the state is designed to do anything, it's to produce these 5 things. But at the same time, we want to think about how the state might do that, and this is what liberals are going to suggest to us about the constitutional or limited nature of the government, the idea that power is fragmented, and that it guarantees some sort of formal or foundational equality. So let's crack on with that. In your own time, you can watch this quite good little video from School of Life about John Locke, and you can try and finish those sentences, but we'll not do that today. So let's think about the first thing, consent. We think about consent, of course, because we have elections and we choose the government that's over us, and we remove them once every 5 years or whenever it is that we get the chance to as well. But if you think about when Locke was writing in the 17th century, they just got rid of a tyrannical king. There he is, Charles I, having his head cut off in 1649. And that was to assert, liberals kind of rationalise this and look back on it later to say that, look, Charles I had suggested he was there because God had put him there. And the problem with accepting that a king is there because God has put them there is that there is no higher authority, and therefore there's no means by which the people could make a king accountable. And that means effectively that government can control people without any limits, without any kind of breaks or safeguards. And that's a kind of an opportunity for tyranny, and that of course prevents people from living as individuals. As we saw last time, the point of being a human being is to live as an individual and to realize yourself. So if we're going to have a government at all then, which is there to ensure we keep our own liberty and our own natural laws, then we must have some consent over it, and that must mean it must have some legitimacy, which comes through our voluntarily accepting authority, and that means we should probably have elections, and we should have a means of removing the people who are in charge of us if they do something wrong with us. This comes down to an idea which actually both Hobbes and Locke thought about, and other 17th century political thinkers developed, this idea of a social contract. We get the clearest expression of this from Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century in a book called The Social Contract. And he's got this idea, there he is, Jean-Jacques, that the people are the ones who are sovereign. So in the 18th century, again, that's a radical thing to say. When you are living in France, it wasn't French, you were Swiss, but if you're living in France under an autocratic monarch, to say that the monarch isn't sovereign, but the people are sovereign, that's a pretty revolutionary thing to do. And of course, that's one of the reasons why Rousseau was celebrated by French revolutionaries. So if you say the people are sovereign, then you say the people should be the ones who construct their civic society. They should be the ones who decide on what its values are. And those values are kind of arrived at collectively, as far as Rousseau's concerned, in something like a general will. What would you call this? A kind of civic consciousness about what is the right way in which individuals should behave in society and how society should behave together. We can look at Rousseau in a bit more detail later on, but this idea of a social contract means that people who are in charge of government shouldn't just do whatever they want to, and if they do something wrong, like Louis XVI here, then we're perfectly justified in removing them and replacing them with somebody to whom we do consent. Okay. So consent, tolerance is in here as well. I put a little clip on here from School of Life again, which reminds us only about Voltaire's famous phrase, I disagree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say. And one of the things you'll see in the video is it wasn't actually him who said it. But we want to think about why it is that the state is there. And of course, it's to guarantee that each individual tolerates the behavior of other individuals. And therefore, the state should be tolerant too. So we don't want a government to stop critics or the opposition or people who disagree with government policy from criticizing it, because in criticizing it, what they're doing is expressing their natural right to give or withdraw their consent from that government. At the same time, we want to make sure that that state tolerates the individuals, the freedom of individuals to say what they like, to believe what they like in terms of religious ideas. And of course, this is going to benefit society eventually because it's going to produce some new ideas. So if the state's there for anything, it should be to protect tolerance, to guide us all in making sure that we tolerate each other's behavior. We might think about, I won't click on this link now, but we might think about whether there should be any limits to tolerance. And of course, when we think about, I don't know, the Westboro Baptist Church in America, who stand outside of the funerals of dead servicemen when they've been brought back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and say that God hates gays and is punishing America by killing its servicemen abroad, we might think that in some ways there ought to be some limits to tolerance. But there's a reason why, from a liberal point of view, those ideas are protected, even in America. Okay, we'll come back to that later. The other thing that the state is supposed to achieve is meritocracy, and meritocracy means being able to make progress in society based on hard work or ability, but not based on where you were born, not based on the class that you were born into or the social order you were born into. So Thomas Paine, who was an 18th century thinker associated with the French Revolution and the American Revolution, said this, that hereditary power, that is the power that you were born into, is beyond equity, beyond reason, and most certainly beyond wisdom. And what he was doing at the time was commenting on the monarch. The monarch for him was King George, who was famously mad. But he would have said the same thing about our royal family and about indeed all monarchs, that the whole point of people who are in power just because they were born there assumes that they are somehow better than other people. And as a good liberal, Thomas Paine would have assumed that all individuals are equal, and therefore all individuals should have equal opportunities to make progress in society. And we might think, when you do your little bit of work on your handout, about why meritocracy is valuable. But of course, one of the ways in which it benefits society in general is that the best, most able people are the ones who are then in positions of responsibility and authority, and that should lead to the best kind of political outcomes. So the point of the state is also to make sure that we get equality of opportunity. Equality is important for liberals because it's based on the idea that we were all born equal. This idea of a foundational or formal equality is important when we're moving away from a society which is no longer based on absolutist rulers, people who were born into hereditary positions. If you're going to have that, then you assume that everybody has the same rights that no one single person's rights are more important than somebody else's. They've got an equal value. And that itself then has got to be protected by legal equality. We'll come on to that a little bit more in the rule of law in a moment. And this equality of opportunity is important for liberals because it's the thing which then guarantees that people can develop as themselves. Developmental individualism is something we looked at last time. And any limits on people's developmental individualism are necessarily limits on their natural rights to equality. There are, however, some disadvantages for this, for some people. For example, not everybody is able to enjoy the same amounts of freedom, even if they're presented with the equal opportunities at the beginning. And in a capitalist society, we might assume that if you failed, it's because you didn't make the most of your individual opportunities. But that might not necessarily be fair in considering the causes of inequality, why some people don't do as well as others in society, or the impact that inequality has on creating more inequality further down the line in society. But we'll look at that again in a bit more in another session. Finally then, justice is one of the things which the state is supposed to guarantee, the reason why we need the state. And that's because we expect there to be fair treatment for everybody. Since everybody has the same equal natural rights, there ought to be a referee to ensure fair play, that everybody gets the same treatment. And this was really a kind of reaction to tyrants and autocratic monarchs who would lock people up without trial, or who would rule by edict in an unlimited sort of way. So what the idea of justice is intended to do is to allow individuals to be able to challenge the state, to limit the state, and also to be able to get remedies against each other or relative to each other. So if you feel like you've been treated unfairly by another citizen, the state is there as a referee to make a judgment about whether or not whether or not they have a case to answer. So what kind of state should we have? Well, this is almost like a kind of blueprint. A state should be fragmented. That is to say that it shouldn't have all power concentrated in the hands of one individual, like an overmighty king. This notion that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, it's not actually an 18th century liberal idea. But Baron Montesquieu, who's a French Enlightenment thinker in the 18th century, developed the idea of a separation of powers, that one of the ways you could guarantee that power was fragmented was by saying that, well, the legislative part should be in one branch, the executive part, the people who actually implement the laws that have been made by the legislative branch, should be in another branch, and then overseeing them should be a judicial branch. So splitting up power. And modern liberals these days often think about the way in which we can fragment power further by having devolution and federalism and other means by which we don't just keep it all in one place. Power can be limited, the state can be limited by a constitution. And if you like, this is an interesting one because it's one way of guaranteeing that the state doesn't become too powerful by codifying rules and then having those rules entrenched so that citizens don't have their liberty taken away by a government which assumes too much power. And in some ways, that's sort of anti-democratic, because what if you vote for a government which wants to take more power and wants to assert more authority? Well, this is a fail-safe. This is a way in which the Constitution is designed to guarantee that the majority just doesn't get their own way and vote for some sort of dictator, but instead a Constitution protects individuals' rights irrespective of who the government is. And then finally, this idea of formal equality again. And formal equality protected in the law, in as much as the rule of law applies to everyone. So it doesn't matter how rich you are or how important you think you are in terms of your job or your position in political authority, the same laws apply in the same way to everyone, and everyone can enjoy the same justice in front of the law without prejudice, so that your individual liberty is then equally protected by the state. Okay, so if that's what we think the state might look like, what would it look like in practice? Well, fortunately, we've got a good example. because in the 18th century, in 1787, in Philadelphia, when the American government was designing what sort of government they would create after they'd broken away from an overmighty tyrant king, King George III, and British rule, they thought, well, what we need is a constitution, and they looked to the 18th century liberal thinkers like John Locke and like Montesquieu in order to come up with their constitution. They guaranteed in the First Amendment that Congress shall make no laws regarding the establishment of a religion or the free exercise thereof. And so they built in tolerance into their own constitution. They guaranteed consent by having elections, which were established every 4 years from 1790. And they fragmented government by making sure that it was not only separation of powers, Congress, Supreme Court, and President, but also states which protected their own rights and had inalienable rights themselves. And they had a Bill of Rights. And of course, the Bill of Rights is there to guarantee that justice and individual freedoms are protected for all citizens. So in many ways, if we wanted to see what the liberal state would look like, it would look like America, for better or worse. And we can think about that in another session as well, and perhaps when I get a chance to have a chat with you about this. Okay, so that is your summary of liberalism and the state. This is our second part of liberalism and core beliefs, and hopefully that's given you some ways of understanding a little more clearly the things that are on the PowerPoint and the things that I want you to read about in the textbook. And from here on in, we'll look at the differences between different types of liberalisms as it develops through the 19th and 20th centuries.